Let me introduce myself. My name is Giuseppe Olina. I was the mayor of the Orta community, notary, jurisconsult, and ambassador of the state of Riviera in Rome in 1569. I am remembered as one of the most prominent personalities in the Cusio area. I was born in Orta in 1540 and died in 1614. On February 2nd, 1583, when the foundation of the Sacro Monte in the forest of San Nicolao was decided, I was the very mayor of the Orta community. On that occasion, we decided that this place would be ideal to represent the life of the other Christ, Francis of Assisi, and that the Franciscans would become its spiritual guardians. Indeed, the medieval church that was already present on this site was home to miracles. On July the 22nd, 1538, the wooden statue of the Virgin Mary wept, changed colour, and poured out sweat. The Sacro Monte of Orta San Giulio had to be erected in this holy place. With this project, we wanted to create a meditative pilgrimage destination modelled on the Sacro Monte of Varallo. Today, I will tell you some interesting facts about the artistic techniques used at Sacro Monte of Orta, and will give you some insight into how we are preserving this wonderful artistic heritage that, by its nature, has been exposed to the elements for more than 500 years. In front of you is a fresco, one of the most well-known wall painting techniques, which uses a chemical phenomenon called lime carbonation. You should know that pigments mixed with water are applied on the plaster surface when it is still wet. The process occurs during drying, when the lime, in contact with carbon dioxide in the air, turns into calcium carbonate. The paint film, spread with this method, turns out to be particularly resistant. We can say, "Lucky us," otherwise we would not be able to still admire these stunning depictions today. Do you know how the walls designed for frescoes were built here at Sacro Monte? Local materials, stone and mortar, were used. They were prepared by laying brown coat, a layer of textured mortar on which the main lines of reference, such as cornices in architecture, were transposed by snapping taut cords onto the surface of the wall. The synopia, which was the underdrawing, was often made with a red or black pigment. A second layer of mortar, thinner than the previous one, was spread on top of it and applied over limited portions called giornate, depending on the difficulty of the subject to be portrayed. This second layer always had to remain wet while waiting for the colour to be applied. Furthermore, painters sometimes used tools for the adaptation of the drawing, such as cord snapping, engravings, and pouncing. I would like to tell you what pigments were used here at Sacro Monte. It is interesting to understand how nature is part and parcel of these works of art. The most used pigments were of natural origin, earths and oxides, like red and yellow ochres, green earth and bone black. To elevate their compositions with bright tones, painters also use some particularly precious pigments, such as azurite and vermilion red, which, however, have the disadvantage of not being compatible with the alkalinity of lime. Therefore, instead of being spread when wet, they were applied on the dry plaster with other types of organic binders, such as animal glues. These parts of frescoes represent very delicate and fragile backdrops, which tend to wear away more rapidly. A curiosity here at Sacro Monte. Some artists like Samyanghini used the lime paint technique to offset this inconvenience by mixing pigments with diluted lime putty so that they could paint even on a dry plaster too. Have you ever seen terracotta statues of these sizes? It feels like being at the theatre, doesn't it? This material is plastic and porous. Plasticity is crucial to be able to take and keep shapes, whilst porosity allows for drying. I will tell you what the procedure was. The clay sketches had to be baked at high temperatures to resist over time. The material had to be washed and left to dry, then finally crushed and placed in a container covered with water. This compound, manually mixed, was called slip. With the help of a sieve, the impurities, grass, rocks were removed. Afterwards, it was left to decant in tanks to facilitate the sand to settle. Until the material was malleable, this procedure had to be performed again. Then it was divided into pieces covered with damp rags waiting to be molded. Are you curious to know how the statues of Sacro Monte were modeled? Firstly, the material was kneaded vigorously before use to favor the removal of air bubbles so as not to create cracks while baking. The sculptures were modeled by hand, harnessing even temporary reinforcement bars made of wood and iron. Then they were sectioned with wire stretched between the hands as soon as the clay had slightly dried. The portions of the sculpture were then hollowed and dug with a stick and the edges engraved to roughen them, so that the reassembly of the parts were made easier after baking. Once the modeling was completed, the sculpture was left to dry slowly in the shade or sheltered from drafts to prevent cracks and fissures from forming. Getting to know the instruments used by artists is like knocking on the door of another era. Firstly, there were the hands, and then sticks of various kind, plain with wide loops, wires for sectioning, compasses, straight and curved calipers to measure distances, rollers to lay the clay, hacksaws and awls. Did you know what risk our artists encountered when baking their sculptures in the oven? The explosion. In fact, especially for bigger pieces, the risk was that they would explode both inside of the oven and during the cooling phase in the absence of enough openings and vent holes. During natural drying, clay always retained some water, which only evaporates at 100 degrees. Therefore, the temperature in the oven always had to be slow and progressive. Would you like to know what errors our artists faced? If organic substances, carbonaceous compounds, had been added to the clay, or if the oven ventilation was insufficient, the pieces would become brown or black, whereas red coloring meant there was good ventilation in the oven and iron oxide in the mixture. Baking had to reach 600 degrees to irreversibly change the chemical composition of the clay by altering the quartz in it and thereby forming glass crystals. Did you know that Sacro Monte chapels are semi-confined spaces embedded in a stunning natural setting that exposes them to the accumulation of dust, leaves, cobwebs, passing of small animals, atmospheric agents such as sun, rain and snow? Do you want to know who oversees them? Since the early 1980s, luckily the Ente di Gestione dei Sacri Monti managing body ensures the conservation, maintenance and enhancement of the historical and artistic heritage of the 7 Sacri Monti of Piedmont. An ordinary and a scheduled work are performed to make everything function. The ordinary maintenance work includes revising roofs, gutters and manholes to control water. Seepage is the #1 enemy of decorative elements. Then the restorer monitors the interior. The statues are gently dusted, as are all the other surfaces, gratings, floors. If there are detached fragments of certain sources, they are repositioned. If foreign materials are found deposited on surfaces, they are removed. Are you curious to discover what to do when an asset is in a state of serious degradation? Today, I will tell you what type of interventions are carried out by the Ente di Gestione dei Sacri Monti in the case of damaged fresco or terracotta statue. When the degradation is very advanced, it is necessary to intervene with a restoration. The following steps are taken. starting research, investigation, and study for an in-depth knowledge of the asset and its conservative history, observing the executive techniques and materials, analyzing previous interventions. First of all, the causes of degradation must be eliminated. Restoring the container into a healthy condition, that is, the building itself, is done to ensure that the interventions can be long-lasting. Do you know what the main cause of degradation is? It is the water that penetrates the walls by seepage, by capillarity of the soil, and by condensation. Sometimes it is the same restoration techniques performed in an inexpert or improper manner that do more harm than good. Today, I would like to tell you about the different phases of restoration at Sacro Monte. Various interventions can be carried out, but firstly, the actual needs of each work must be assessed. Usually, however, at Sacro Monte, the materials are secured, consolidated, such as detached plasters, raised or uneven paint film. Surfaces are cleaned and overlaid, or no longer functional materials are removed. Detached fragments are relocated in the case of the terracotta statues. Small elements like fingers are reconstructed. The areas affected by color drops are retouched with reversible materials with the aim of limiting visual interference and allowing optimal interpretation of the works, while fully respecting the original materials and their conservation history. Did you also know that all these operations are performed under the control and collaboration of the government department responsible for monuments, the environment, and historical buildings? Together with the damages caused by water, the most frequent degradation phenomena of wall paintings can be linked to structural problems of the building, of which the plasterwork constitutes a coating, cracks, fissures. Detachments and bulging of the plaster, the presence of salt efflorescence, raising and falling of paint film are common. In short, there is always a lot to be done, considering that the chapels are constantly exposed to all these risk factors. Let's have a look at the degradation factors for terracotta statues. They can be structural problems related to the state of preservation of the supportive reinforcements. Some fragments may detach, especially the ones sticking out the most, like fingers and hands. Paint film may also lift and fall off. Throughout the centuries, statues have often been maintained improperly, such as real repainting, while nowadays the restoration etiquette aims at the utmost respect for the artifact, that is, its material consistency and its conservation history.